Hey guys, welcome back to another banner review video on the Sword of Convalera global version of the game. In this video, I'll be covering the upcoming banner where Hasna will be the featured legendary character. As always, I will also be including timestamps in the video description that you can skip ahead to the section that you are interested in. Now, Hasna is a Seeker class character, but something different from other Seekers is that she's magic based and she plays more or less like a mage type character. Her playstyle and kit revolves around debuffing an enemy with something called the Hidden Fragrance. The way it works is very similar to, say, the Hangman's Mark, where you've probably be familiar with if you've played the game for some time now, because all the area King's Army faction can more or less apply the Hangman's Mark. So Hasna functions the same way. The only difference, of course, is that Hidden Fragrance is a unique debuff that only Hasna can apply, and only Hasna more or less can make use of. So we'll start off with her character trait, which is on the top right hand side of the slide, and this is pretty key to how she functions. First of all, Hasna herself is immune to the blind debuff, and her trait increases her attack depending on the star level of her trait. And at the end of every turn, she inflicts Hidden Fragrance on enemies within 3 tiles of her, but lasting only for 1 turn. The one thing that the rest of the party can make use of is enemies debuffed with her Hidden Fragrance also suffer a drop in their attack and defense and will be easier to be critically hit by anyone else in your party. So at least that's something going for the rest of your party. But virtually everything else related to this debuff is unique for Hasna alone. Her default skill isn't actually very good because it doesn't really synergize with the rest of her kit, so I would actually recommend to skip her default skill entirely, and as you level, just replace the default skill with one of her other skills. But looking at the rest of her kit, you notice that this time I put in quite a lot of skills here. Keeping in mind, of course, that as with all characters, Hasna is only limited to 3 active skills or passives. But as I go through the rest of her kit, I will mention options and what you can pick up or drop. It really depends a lot on your playstyle and preference, and of course who else you bring into the battle. Depending on your party makeup, certain skills might shine over others, but I'll cover this as I go along. I'll start off with her rank 1, and really I think this is the most optional out of her entire kit. If you're really pressed for choices, I will actually just recommend to drop the rank 1. And out of the rank 1, the one that I think is better for Hasna is Battle Fever. That's a passive that gives her 15% damage reduction after she lands an active attack, and an additional 25% damage reduction for a total of 40% if the attack is a critical hit. And with Hasna, it's actually pretty easy to get a critical hit, so more or less you'll be getting a 40% damage reduction, which is pretty sizable. The main issue though is that this is really only a damage reduction. I'm more a fan of increasing damage overall because I think that it's better to kill off enemy units and get your survivability that way rather than hope that enemies don't group up and gang against a single character. So I think out of all her kit, this is probably the easiest to drop, but I do want to make a mention here because 40% damage reduction is pretty sizable, and depending on the fight, of course, or maybe in certain PvP situations, you might want to have the extra damage reduction, and because of that, and you do need to pick up one of the rank 1 skills anyway, this is certainly an option in certain situations where you really want to maximize her survivability. Now rank 3 actually presents quite an interesting dilemma because both the rank 3 left and right option are pretty good for Hasna. If you don't want to spend a Castelia and you really only want to pick one, I would recommend the one on the right called Scented Trace. This is also a passive, but it's pretty good for her kit overall. It allows all her attack to apply the Hidden Fragrance debuff on the target, and this time for 2 turns, which is pretty good because she really does need the debuff in order to perform optimally. She's pretty underwhelming when she's attacking enemies without that debuff, And on top of this, it also allows her to restore 2 energy when she attacks enemies with that debuff, which is pretty nice. It helps with sustain, and as you all know, energy is always important for mage type characters. It also gives her a 40% HP heal each time she defeats an enemy with that debuff, and that's pretty nice for her survivability as well. In my opinion, I think this is one of her core skills and should more or less almost always be included in her kit. You can possibly consider doing without if you want to focus more on her basic attack, where you don't really need the energy, but I'll cover that more when I get to her basic attack. The other option on the left hand side of her rank 3 is Aroma Assault, and this is something that you can consider to pick up also if you have the Castelia to spare. This is a 2 energy, but notably no cooldown single target attack. That does a pretty decent 150% damage modifier, and it applies the Hidden Fragrance debuff in an AoE style. Now the damage itself from this attack is single target, don't get me wrong, but the application of this skill is pretty nice because it allows debuffing multiple units at once with her Hidden Fragrance, and that way it's much easier to get off attacks on enemies with that debuff, and makes Hasna a bit more consistent overall. If you do use the Castelia, this skill also synergizes very well with Scented Trace, because Scented Trace restores 2 energy and this skill requires 2 energy. Having both these skills together on a bar means that you can just use Aroma Assault every single turn with Hasna without worry about her energy getting depleted. Rank 5 gives her a very nice reaction skill, where it's an outright 30% damage reduction as long as the enemies attacking Hasna has the Hidden Fragrance debuff. So you can start to see why it's very important to have as many enemies hit with this debuff as much as possible. Notably, if you did pick up the rank 1 and you're using the Battle Fever rank 1 passive, the damage reduction do stack, so that's massive damage reduction overall. But this is one of the reasons why I did mention that rank 1 Battle Fever is pretty optional. In most cases, you probably can do without that much damage reduction. The 30% is more or less enough, and you can sort of supplement her sustainability with the 40% heal each time she defeats an enemy through her rank 3 Scented Trace passive. Rank 7 gives her yet another interesting passive. This passive allows her to start the turn with a crit buff, increasing also the range of her attacks by 1 tile, which is always nice, and allowing her to move again for 2 tiles after she lands an attack, so this greatly helps her mobility as well. Something that I haven't mentioned yet is Hasna only has a 3 tile mobility, and that is very poor for a Seeker class character. In essence, you really can't look at Hasna the same way as other typical Seekers play. Hasna really is a mage type character, so she functions sort of like Barrel, and where you have low mobility but higher damage to make up for it. The drawback with Hasna, and the reason why many people aren't interested in her, is that she doesn't have the AoE, and having low mobility for a Seeker is pretty bad, because normally when you bring in Seekers, you also want to bring them in your party for their higher mobility. So having the rank 7 Scent Tracker helps to alleviate her mobility issues somewhat, because she gets the extra range and extra 2 tiles of movement after the attack. Having the crit buff also helps a lot, because it plays in nicely with her rank 1 if you happen to pick it up. The thing about rank 7 though is that if you aren't too fast about mobility and range for some reason, and if you have another character that can apply the crit buff, such as Cocoa in battle, then potentially you can consider dropping rank 7 altogether to make room for one of her other active skills or passives. Without a character that can grant crit buff though, I would highly recommend to pick up rank 7, because overall, considering the crit buff and the mobility assisting utility, it is pretty core, I think, to get her to function optimally. rank 9 basic attack, she gets a pretty good basic attack overall, where the rank 9 basic attack allows for extra damage if she hits a character debuffed by Hidden Fragrance, and more or less this is almost always a given. If you want to bring Hasna in battle, you want to focus on landing Hidden Fragrance as much as possible anyway, so having a basic attack that utilizes this makes a lot of sense. And the extra damage from the basic attack always guarantees to be a critical hit, so this basic attack actually hits pretty hard, and it also always triggers Battle Fever. If you really took Battle Fever and you want a 40% DR, then you definitely want to go with this. Finally, at rank 11, gives her access to a very big nuke called Penetrating. Now this attack does 170% modifier damage against enemies debuffed with Hidden Fragrance, and like I said, if you really want to use Hasna, you more or less have to assume enemies are debuffed by this, and you should always only be attacking enemies debuffed with Hidden Fragrance. It also boosts her crit and crit damage by an additional 15% when she does this attack. So if this combines with other crit buffs, you can actually see potentially big numbers out of this. Again, this is only single target, it's not AoE, and it does cost 4 energy, so it's pretty energy hungry. But that being said, it doesn't have a cooldown, so that's one thing. The other thing though is, remember that she does have the Scented Trace passive at rank 3, where she restores 2 energy each time she hits a target with a debuff with Hidden Fragrance. So assuming you get the 2 energy refund, essentially this only costs you 2 energy, meaning that it is pretty spammable, especially if you have energy support for Hasna as well, and potentially you can see her really doing big damage every single turn. So one option is to go for Scented Trace and Penetrating, and in the 1 or 2 turns in the battle where you don't have the 4 energy, you can always just use her rank 9 basic to at least still do some very decent damage. Another option though, if you don't want to go for this, is just do without Penetrating and then spam the Aroma Assault rank 3 as a main nuke. It's only 20% damage potency lower, but it is more energy friendly, and you don't have to worry about energy support for Hasna, so it really depends which route you want to go. I would say go for the rank 11 if you don't have the Castelia to spare for Aroma Assault, and if you have energy support, that's probably the better way to go. If you don't have that sort of support for Hasna and you want to spend the Castelia, I actually think it's then in a way probably better to just go for Aroma Assault and get the consistency of 150% damage every single turn. I would imagine both are pretty viable, whichever route you want to go, and it's more a matter of playstyle and what sort of other characters you have in your roster. So looking at Hasna's Kit, what are my thoughts on the character? She certainly is an interesting character from the class and uniqueness perspective, because she's the very first mage type seeker unit, and she specializes in marking enemies. Like I said, very similar in a way how the Hangman's Mark works. The only difference is that it's more or less exclusive to Hasna, the Hidden Fragrance debuff. She performs actually very decently versus marked enemies, and her numbers can get pretty high, but take note, in terms of damage, she has no AoE attacks whatsoever for a mage, and for a mage, I must say that is pretty disappointing. Take for example Beryl, which has been released from the start of the game. Beryl also does very nice damage still up to this day, and at least in the case of Beryl, she does have AoE capabilities in her arsenal. Take note that for Hasna to perform decently, she does need to attack enemies marked with Hidden Fragrance, and therein lies the problem with Hasna. She is very underwhelming if she's taking attacks or attacking unmarked enemies. And looking at her kit, regardless of whether you want to take her rank 3 AoE or not, her very first turn, she only marks enemies at the end of her turn from her trait. So her first turn is essentially attacking unmarked enemies, and she won't do anything much on her first turn. It's really only on round 2 onwards that she starts to do decent damage. If for some reason there are no marked enemies for her to attack, say if another character has killed them off, or if the enemy party starts using attacks from range, where they use an archer or mage type character, or maybe even a seeker character with high mobility to get to Hasna before they are marked, she is going to suffer quite a lot of damage. Her rank 5 reaction 30% damage reduction is only against marked enemies. She has no dodge capabilities whatsoever, so even in a PvP type situation, she is going to suffer a lot of damage if the enemies play around her Hidden Fragrance debuff, unless you pick up the rank 1 Battle Fever for the 40% damage reduction. But if you do that, then you have to sacrifice another active skill or passive, so there are drawbacks or trade-offs that you have to consider, and it is very crippling for her to get to be able to only do decent damage versus marked enemies. The other big drawback with Hasna is that because she's the only, as far as I can see, the only mage type seeker in the game, as of now, most people, myself included, when you invest in your talent tree for seekers, you will obviously be focusing more on the physical attack branches, because there's no point to boost seekers magic attack up till now, in which case by the time Hasna drops, your magic attack branch of the talent tree will probably be underdeveloped, at least relative to the physical attack branch. So for Hasna to do well, you will also need to start considering putting investment into the magic attack branch of the talent tree. So there is that degree of investment required. And finally, like I said earlier, Hasna really has pretty low mobility. At 3 tiles, it's on par with slow mage type characters or breakers, and even with her rank 7 allowing her to move 2 extra tiles, that is only after attacking an enemy unit, so it's not the same as other seekers being able to move 5 tiles, for example. And you do have to factor that in as you put together your party. She doesn't have exceptional jump like Cole, for example. She only moves 3 tiles, and you need to get her close in order to mark enemy units, and if she's that close with only 3 tiles of mobility, she is in a very vulnerable position most times in the fight. For these reasons, Hasna isn't rated very highly, and I can see why it's very hard to fit her in the current meta. There's not many situations where you really want to bring Hasna. It is true that she is immune to the blind debuff. I only briefly mentioned that when I covered her trait, but honestly speaking, at this point of the game, when do you ever see the blind debuff? I think the only rare cases is when you fight Miguel in the Tower challenge, or in the recent Voyage of Discovery event where he can land the blind debuff. But beyond that, you don't really see the blind debuff that much as well, so it's a pretty low value immunity to have, unless of course if they drop an event where there's a big boss character that can apply a blind, then sure, Hasna will shine. But beyond that, at best I think she only performs decently, and she only performs decently when you fulfill the conditions of hitting marked enemies or enemies marked with the Hidden Fragrance debuff. So there are conditions to that, and I just don't see that it's worthwhile investing all this into her Castelia for her rank 3, all the investments for the magic attack branch of the talent tree, just to get this level of performance overall. That's it for this video. As always, I hope it's been helpful, and till then I'll catch you guys in the next banner review video. Bye!